Kethvorn had existed since before the first stars learned to burn. And in all that time, he had known only one truth. Fear was the sweetest meal in the universe. He was a fear-eater, one of the ancient entities that drifted through the darkness between galaxies. Drawn to terror like a predator drawn to blood in the water, for 10,000 years, he had followed the great wars across the cosmos, feasting on the dread of species facing extinction. The Volanthi had fed him well when their world burned. The crystalline Sheth had screamed in frequencies only he could hear as their civilization crumbled. The proud Karun had wept and begged and died, and Kethvorn had grown fat on their despair. He had never known failure in his hunting. He had never encountered prey that did not eventually break. Then came the war between the hegemony of 12 suns and a young species called humanity. The hegemony was ancient and cruel. Rulers of 1,000 star systems for 40,000 years, they had begun what they called a cleansing, sweeping through the younger races and crushing them beneath their war machines. Kethvorn followed their fleets like a shadow, drinking deep from the terror that preceded their conquests. When the hegemony turned their attention to a small human colony world called New Antioch, Kethvorn descended to feed. The colony was doomed, and everyone knew it. 50,000 humans against the greatest military force in the known galaxy. It should have been a feast beyond measure. Kethvorn materialized in the ruins of what had once been a marketplace, his form a thing of shadows and hunger, and he opened his senses to drink in the fear. It was everywhere. Thick and rich and intoxicating mothers clutched their children in underground shelters. Hearts pounding with terror, soldiers checked their weapons with trembling hands. Knowing they faced overwhelming odds, old men stared at the sky where enemy ships blocked out the stars, remembering the peace they would never see again. But something was wrong. The fear was there, yes, but it did not flow the way it should. It did not pool and stagnate and rot into despair. Instead, it moved like a river, channeled and directed, transformed into something else entirely. Kethvorn watched in confusion as a woman, whose hands shook with terror-loaded ammunition, into a rifle and marched toward the defensive line. He observed a man whose heart hammered so loud that Kethvorn could hear it across the street carry wounded soldiers to safety, making trip after trip despite his obvious panic. He saw children crying in fear while their parents built barricades above them, every adult knowing they would probably die, but working anyway. This was not how prey behaved. This was not how any species behaved when death came for them. Kethvorn drifted closer, fascinated despite himself, trying to understand what he was witnessing. That was when Elena Vasquez stumbled into the ruined marketplace. She was young for a soldier, barely 25 years old. Her uniform, torn and dirty from days of fighting, blood from a wound on her forehead had dried across her face, and exhaustion made her movements clumsy. She had been separated from her unit during an hegemony bombardment and was trying to find her way back to friendly lines. When she saw Kethvorn, she froze. He let her see him fully, all shadows and ancient malice. A nightmare given form. He tasted her fear spike, sharp and electric, and waited for the madness to take her, as it had taken so many others who glimpsed his true nature. Elena Vasquez raised her rifle with shaking arms. Her voice cracked when she spoke, but she spoke anyway. "I do not know what you are," she said, "but if you are here to fight us, get in line." Kethvorn had consumed the terror of 1,000,000 species across 1,000,000 years. He had broken minds with a glance and fed on entire civilizations as they crumbled. No creature had ever stood before him and issued a challenge. He laughed, and the sound was like metal tearing, like ice cracking, like the death of hope itself. But Elena did not run. Her fear burned brighter than ever, so intense that Kethvorn could taste it like fire on his tongue. But she did not run. She stood her ground with her tiny weapon and her fragile body and her impossibly defiant eyes. Something happened then that Kethvaran did not understand. Her fear changed. It was still fear, still rich and pure and overwhelming. But it had been transformed. It was fear that had been seized and mastered, and forged into something new. It was fear that had become fuel. The taste of it burned him in a way nothing had burned him in 10,000 years. And in that burning, something ancient stirred deep in his memory, buried under eons of predation and hunger. There was a word he had almost forgotten: the binding. It was said that in the first age of the universe, fear-eaters could be bound to mortal champions, yoked to those rare souls who embodied the highest form of fear, not the fear that breaks, but the fear that builds, not the terror that paralyzes, but the terror that propels courage. Some species called it. Others called it madness. Kethvaran had always believed it was myth, but as he stared at Elena Vasquez, he felt chains he had not known existed wrap around his essence. He tried to flee, to dissolve into the darkness between stars, as he had always done. But he could not move. He was bound to this human, this impossible, infuriating, fascinating human who stood before a god of nightmares and told it to wait its turn. "What is happening to me?" he snarled. Elena lowered her rifle slightly, confusion replacing some of her fear. "I was about to ask you the same thing." The bombardment resumed then, hegemony weapons turning the night into fire. And Elena ran for cover. Kethvaran found himself pulled along behind her, a shadow that could not escape its source for the first time in his eternal existence. The fear-eater was not the hunter. He was the caught, and as he followed Elena Vasquez through the burning streets of New Antioch, Kethvaran realized that his existence would never be the same. He had found something he never knew he was looking for. He had found a species that did not surrender to fear. He had found humans, and now, whether he wanted it or not, he belonged to them. The binding held firm no matter how hard Kethvaran fought against it. In the days that followed his encounter with Elena Vasquez, he raged against his invisible chains like a wild beast caught in a trap. He was an ancient power, a devourer of civilizations, and he had been snared by a creature whose entire species had only discovered fire a handful of millennia ago. The humiliation burned worse than any wound. He tried everything to break free. He attempted to drift away into the void between stars, but an invisible force pulled him back toward the human colony. He tried to drive Elena mad, flooding her dreams with visions of horror, showing her the death of 100 species, the screaming end of worlds without number. She woke gasping and covered in sweat. And then she went to her morning briefing and helped plan the colony's defense. Nothing worked. The binding would not release him after 2 weeks of futile struggle. Kethvaran finally appeared before Elena in her small quarters, manifesting from the shadows in the corner of the room. She was cleaning her weapon, her movements mechanical from exhaustion, and when she looked up at him, there was no surprise in her eyes. "You are still here," she said. "I cannot leave," Kethvaran admitted, and the words tasted like poison. "Then make yourself useful," she returned, to cleaning her weapon as if she had not just given a command to an entity older than her entire world. Kethvaran stared at her for a long moment, caught between fury and fascination. No creature had ever spoken to him that way. No creature had ever treated him as anything less than a nightmare to be fled from or a god to be worshipped. This human treated him like an inconvenient guest who was overstaying his welcome despite his anger. Curiosity began to gnaw at him. He had fed on countless species in his long existence, but he had never stayed to watch them after the feeding began. He had always moved on to easier prey, leaving the dying civilizations to their fate. Now, trapped by the binding, he had no choice but to observe. What he saw confused him more with each passing day. The siege of New Antioch tightened like a noose. Hegemony forces surrounded the colony. cutting off supply lines and bombarding the settlement at random intervals. Food grew scarce. Medicine ran low, and everyone knew that relief was unlikely to come. The humans should have broken. Every logical calculation said they should surrender, but they did not. Kethvorin watched Elena sit with a dying friend, holding his hand as the light faded from his eyes. Her grief was enormous. A vast dark ocean of pain, but she did not drown in it. She channeled it into something harder, something sharper, and when she rose from her friend's deathbed, she went straight to the armory to prepare for the next assault. He observed the colony's commander, a weathered man named General Okonkwo, make decisions that sent men and women to certain death. The general knew the cost of every order he gave. Kethvorin could see it in the man's mind, a perfect accounting of every life lost under his command. But Okonkwo did not crumble beneath that weight. He carried it like armor and projected calm certainty to his troops, even as guilt ate at his heart. "You are broken," Kethvorin told Elena one night as she stood guard on the perimeter. "Your fear responses do not function correctly." Elena did not look at him, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the defensive wall. "They work fine," she said. "We just do not. Let them drive." Kethvorin considered this. "Explain." "Fear is just information." Elena said, "It tells us something is dangerous, that we might die, that we should run or hide or fight." She adjusted her grip on her rifle. "Most species hear that message and obey it without thinking, right?" "Yes, humans hear it too," Elena continued. "But somewhere along the way, maybe because we grew up on a death world full of predators and disasters, we learned to listen to the message without following it blindly." She finally looked at him, her eyes hard in the starlight. "We learn to be afraid and act anyway. To use the fear as fuel instead of letting it use us." The hegemony's ground assault came 3 days later. Kethvorin watched from the shadows as wave after wave of enemy soldiers crashed against the human defenses. The colonists were outnumbered 10-1. Their weapons outdated, their supplies nearly gone. They should have been slaughtered. Instead, they fought like demons. Kethvorin saw humans die, their screams filling the night, their terror radiating like heat from a fire. But he also saw their comrades step over the bodies and keep shooting. He watched a young man take a wound that should have sent him into shock, bind it with hands that would not stop shaking, and return to the defensive line. He observed Elena take a plasma bolt to the shoulder, fall, rise, and charge forward with a battle cry that seemed far too large for her small human body. The fear was everywhere, thick and rich, the finest feast Kethvorin had ever witnessed. But it was not the fear of prey waiting to die. It was the fear of predators determined to make their deaths. Cost everything, the assault was repelled. The humans paid dearly for their victory, their casualties mounting to levels that would have broken any other species. But when the sun rose over New Antioch, the colony still stood that night. Kethvorin found Elena sitting alone in the medical bay, her wounded shoulder bandaged. Her face pale from blood loss, she was staring at nothing. And for a moment, Kethvorin thought she had finally broken. Then she spoke. 14. She said, 14 people from my unit died today. She looked up at him. I could not save them. No. Kethvorin agreed. You could not, but I saved some. Elena continued. I kept fighting even when I was afraid, and some of them are alive because of that. She closed her eyes. That is all any of us can do. Is it not? Kethvorin did not answer. He had no answer to give, for the first time in 10,000 years. The Fear Eater did not try to feed on the terror surrounding him. He found, to his utter bewilderment, that he was not hungry. Instead, he was thinking about what Elena had said. Fear is just information. Use it as fuel instead of letting it use you. Perhaps, he thought, there were other ways to consume fear besides feeding on the broken. Perhaps there was another path, one he had forgotten long ago, and perhaps these strange, stubborn, impossible humans could show him what it was. The siege of New Antioch entered its third month, and everything began to change. The hegemony commanders had expected the human colony to surrender within weeks. As every other species had done when faced with certain destruction, they had sent generous surrender terms, promising quick deaths instead of slow ones, offering mercy to those who laid down their weapons. The humans had responded by launching raids against hegemony supply lines. Now the enemy was confused and angry, unable to understand why this inferior species refused to accept the inevitable. Kethvorin understood, though he had not at first. He had spent 3 months watching humans transform fear into fury, terror into tenacity, panic into purpose. He had seen them weep for their dead and then pick up their fallen comrades' weapons. He had witnessed them comfort the dying with gentle words and then charge enemy positions with savage screams. They were unlike any species he had ever encountered, and slowly, without meaning to, Kethvorin began to change as well. It started with small things. His ancient senses could detect threats that human instruments could not, and he found himself warning Elena of danger before it arrived. A hegemony sniper hidden in the ruins, a patrol approaching through the sewers, a bombardment that would hit her position in minutes. Each time he told her, and each time she acted on his warnings without question. Then came the night when a hegemony assassination squad infiltrated the colony, hunting for General Okonkwo. Kethvorin felt them coming. 5 elite soldiers moving through the darkness with weapons, designed to kill quickly and quietly. He could have let them pass. He could have watched them murder the human commander and fed on the fear that would follow. Instead, he appeared before them in the narrow alley where they moved, letting them see his true form. For the first time, shadows that writhed and hungered, eyes that burned with the cold fire of dead stars, a presence that spoke of ancient evil and endless night. The hegemony soldiers were well trained, veterans of 100 campaigns, killers who had faced death many times and survived. They looked upon Kethvorin and they screamed. He consumed their terror as they fled, drinking deep of their panic. And when it was over, he found Elena standing at the mouth of the alley, watching him. There was something in her eyes he could not identify. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I did not do it for you." Kethvorin replied, but they both knew he was lying. Word spread among the hegemony forces. Something was in the human colony, something that struck from shadows and fed on fear. Their soldiers began to hesitate before patrols, to jump at sounds in the night, to whisper about the demon that protected the stubborn colonists. Kethvorin fed on their growing dread and found it more satisfying than anything he had tasted in millennia. This was not the fear of helpless prey waiting to die. This was the fear of predators who had discovered they were not alone in the darkness. As the weeks passed, memories began to stir in the depths of Kethvorin's ancient mind. He remembered things he had long forgotten, truths buried under eons of hunger and predation. Fear-eaters had not always been scavengers. In the first age of the universe, when young species huddled around their fires and trembled at the darkness beyond, his kind had served a different purpose. They had been guardians then, consuming the fear that paralyzed young civilizations so that courage could grow in its place. They had been protectors, not predators. But something had changed over the long ages. Perhaps it was loneliness, drifting through the empty spaces between stars. Perhaps it was the endless hunger that never truly faded, whatever the cause. Fear-eaters had forgotten their purpose and become the very nightmares they once guarded. Against Kethvorin found Elena one night in the colony's memorial garden, where the names of the fallen were carved into stone. She came here often, he had noticed, to read the names and remember the faces. "What are you thinking?" she asked without looking at him. She had learned to sense his presence now, an awareness that came from their strange bond. Kethvorin considered the question for a long moment. "I am thinking that I have been feeding on the wrong thing," he said finally, for a very long time. The hegemony's final assault came at dawn on the 93rd day of the siege, 100,000 soldiers. Against the colony's remaining 2,000 defenders, dropships filled the sky like locusts, and war machines that could level cities rolled toward the walls. General Okonkwo addressed his troops for the last time, his voice calm and steady. "We have held this ground for 3 months against an empire that has never known defeat," he said. "Whatever happens today, we have already won something they can never take from us. We have shown the galaxy that humans do not break." The battle began, and it was everything the hegemony had promised. Walls fell, positions were overrun, and humans died by the hundreds in the first hour. Alone, Kethfor watched from the shadows, feeling the terror rise like a tide, and he made his choice. He manifested not as a lurking horror at the edges of perception, but as something else entirely. He rose up like a vast wave of darkness and swept across the human minds. And as he passed, he did something he had not done in 10 million years. He consumed their fear, not to feed his own hunger, but to transform it. He took their terror and their panic and their certainty of death, and he burned it away, leaving behind only the fierce, clean fire of courage for one transcendent hour. 2,000 humans fought without fear. They moved with perfect clarity, every action precise, every decision unclouded by doubt or dread. They became something more than mortal. Warriors who felt no terror because their terror had been taken from them and forged into something greater. The hegemony soldiers faced an enemy that did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not show any of the signs that prey showed when it was about to die. They faced humans who fought with cold fury and absolute conviction, and they faced Kethfor, who swept through their ranks like death itself, consuming their fear and leaving only madness behind. When the relief fleet from Earth's Third Fleet finally broke through the hegemony blockade, they found New Antioch still standing. The walls were shattered, the buildings burned, and bodies lay everywhere, but the human flag still flew over the colony center. And in the shadows, invisible to all but Elena Vasquez, Kethfor watched the sunrise with something that felt almost like pride. He had remembered what he was meant to be. He had found his purpose again after so long in the darkness, and he had found it here. Among these impossible, infuriating, magnificent humans, the war was not over in truth. It had barely begun, but for the first time in his ancient existence, Kethfor knew which side he was fighting on. The liberation of New Antioch sent shockwaves through the galaxy. A young species with barely a century of interstellar travel had held against the hegemony of 12 suns for 3 months. It should have been impossible. It was impossible, and yet it had happened. Elena Vasquez was promoted to lieutenant and transferred to the battleship Defiance, one of Earth's newest warships. Kethfor followed her, though the binding no longer compelled him as it once had. He chose to stay, and that choice meant more than any chain ever could. The war entered a new phase. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival on isolated colony worlds. They were taking the offensive, striking at hegemony supply lines, liberating occupied planets, showing the galaxy that the ancient empire could be challenged. And everywhere the human fleets went, Kethfor went with them. The binding had evolved in ways neither he nor Elena fully understood. It was no longer just a connection between the two of them, but a web that spread through humanity's military forces. Kethfor could feel millions of human minds now, each one carrying that strange and wonderful fear that he had first discovered on New Antioch, fear that was acknowledged and mastered and transformed, fear that became fuel for courage instead of chains of paralysis. He drew strength from that web in ways he had never drawn strength before, and in return, he gave him something precious. He became their shadow, their guardian, their monster in the darkness who fought other monsters. The hegemony learned to dread human fleets before each engagement. Darkness would sweep through their formations. An ancient presence that probed their minds and tasted their terror. Soldiers who had fought 1,000 battles began to hesitate. Officers who had never known fear found themselves waking from nightmares they could not remember. Desertion rates climbed. Mutinies became common. Entire garrisons surrendered rather than face the thing that traveled with humanity. Kethvorin consumed all of it, and for the first time in his existence, he felt truly satisfied. This was not the empty feeding of a scavenger picking at corpses. This was purpose. This was meaning. This was what he had been created to do in ages past. The war raged for 2 years across 100 star systems. Humanity won battles they should have lost and paid prices that would have broken other species. They wept for their dead and buried them with honors, and then returned to the fight. They never stopped, never surrendered, never forgot what they were fighting for, and through it all, Kethvorin fought beside them. But the hegemony was ancient and cunning, and they did not accept defeat easily. There, scholars began to research the shadow that accompanied humanity. They dug through forbidden archives and consulted with species that remembered the time before their empire. They learned what Kethvorin was, and they learned that such entities were not invincible on the ice moon of Tertius 7. In ruins older than the hegemony itself, they found what they were looking for. It was a cage built by species now long extinct, a prison designed in the universe's first age to contain entities of living shadow. The hegemony smuggled the device to their fortress world of Haren's Gate and waited for the human fleet to come. Elena was on the bridge of the Defiance when the trap was sprung. The battle had been fierce but winnable. Human ships cutting through hegemony formations with practiced precision. Victory was within reach when the sky tore open and something wrong poured through. Kethvorin felt it immediately. A pulling sensation like hooks in his essence. He tried to resist, tried to anchor himself to the web of human minds that had become his home. But the cage was designed for beings like him. It knew exactly how to tear him away. Elena screamed his name as shadows ripped from the hull of the Defiance. She felt him going, felt the bond between them stretching and tearing. And she reached for him with everything she had. It was not enough. The cage closed around Kethvorin, and for the first time in his eternal existence he felt what it was to be truly trapped. The cage was beautiful in its cruelty. It was made of crystallized mathematics, equations that described the end of all shadows, formulas that negated darkness itself inside its walls. Kethvorin diminished, his vast presence compressed into something small and weak and fading. He could still sense the outside world dimly, could feel the human fleet continuing to fight, could taste their fear and their fury at losing him, but he could not reach them. He was alone in a way he had not been alone since before the binding. The humans won the Battle of Haren's Gate, but the cost was catastrophic. Without Kethvorin to consume the enemy's fear and bolster human courage, the fighting was brutal and close. General Okonkwo died leading a boarding action against a hegemony command ship. Thousands of others fell with him. Elena survived. Though she wished she had not, she could still feel the empty space where Kethvorin had been. A wound in her mind that would not heal. Military command wanted to press forward, to win the war before the hegemony could use the cage again. Elena had different plans. She went to the Admiral's office and requested a leave of absence. Denied, the Admiral said. We need every officer we have. Then I resign my commission, Elena replied. The Admiral stared at her. You would throw away your career for that thing. That thing saved New Antioch, Elena said. That thing has been fighting beside us for 2 years. Has saved more human lives than we can count. Has become part of who we are. She stood at attention, her eyes hard. I'm not throwing anything away, sir. I'm going to bring him home. She left the admiral's office with her resignation accepted, and a storm brewing in her heart within a day. She had gathered volunteers, soldiers who had fought beside her at New Antioch, pilots who had felt Kethvoran's presence strengthen them in battle, men and women who understood that some debts could only be paid in person. They stole a stealth ship from a supply depot and set course for the heart of the hegemony. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew it. They went anyway, because that was what humans did, and because somewhere in the darkness, trapped and fading and alone, Kethvoran was waiting for them. The hegemony's oldest world was called Throne, a name that spoke of their arrogance and their power. For 40,000 years, it had been the seat of their empire, a fortress world surrounded by the mightiest fleet in the known galaxy. At its heart stood the Temple of Eternal Victory, where the hegemony kept their most sacred treasures and their most dangerous weapons. The cage that held Kethvoran was there, in the deepest vault, guarded by 10,000 of their finest soldiers. Elena's stolen ship slipped through the outer defenses using codes purchased from corrupt officers and bribery that cost everything the team had. They landed in a cargo district on the planet's dark side and began the long journey toward the temple. There were 12 of them when they started. By the time they reached the temple walls, there were 7. Elena did not let herself grieve for the fallen. There would be time for that later, or there would be no time at all. Either way, grief would not help them now. The temple's defenses were ancient and layered, designed to stop armies. Elena's team was not an army, they were humans, which meant they found ways through that no army would have attempted. They crawled through ventilation systems meant only for maintenance drones. They climbed walls that sensors said were unclimbable. They killed silently and moved quickly and refused to stop no matter how many times the odds said they should. 4 more fell in the outer corridors, then 2 more in the inner sanctums approach. When Elena finally reached the vault where the cage was kept, she was alone. Blood from a dozen wounds soaked her uniform, and exhaustion made every step an act of will. But she was still moving, still fighting, still refusing to break. The vault doors were locked with codes she did not have, so she used explosives. That should not have been enough when the smoke cleared. She stepped through the wreckage with her weapon raised. The cage sat in the center of the chamber, a sphere of crystallized mathematics that hurt to look at inside it, barely visible. Kethvoran flickered like a candle in a hurricane. He saw her and his voice came thin and distant, like wind through dead leaves. "You came," he said. "You should not have. The war needs you elsewhere." Elena walked toward the cage, ignoring the pain in her body and the alarm screaming throughout the temple. The war can wait. She studied the cage with eyes that had learned to see patterns in chaos, looking for any weakness in its perfect geometry. "How do I break this thing?" "You cannot," Kethvoran said. "It was built to hold entities like me for eternity. Nothing lasts forever." Elena replied, "Everything has a flaw." She ran her hands over the cage's surface and flinched at the wrongness of it. "What powers this thing?" "Fear," Kethvoran said, and there was bitter amusement in his fading voice. "The fear of those who created it, crystallized and preserved across the ages. It uses fear as fuel. Ironic, is it not?" Elena understood then. She understood what she had to do. What only she could do. What everything in her life had been preparing her for. "You told me once that humans were broken," she said, "that our fear responses do not work correctly. I remember. You were wrong." She placed both palms flat against the cage. "We are not broken. We are evolved. We learned to use fear as fuel too, to transform it into something else." She closed her eyes and thought of everything she feared. She thought of death, slow and painful in an enemy temple far from home. She thought of failure, of Kethvoran fading away, of the war lost because she was not strong enough. She thought of everyone she had loved and lost. Of new Antioch's dead. Of the friends who had fallen getting her this far. She let the fear fill her completely. Let it become everything. Let it consume her until there was nothing left but terror. And then she did what humans had learned to do. Across 10,000 generations of surviving on a world that wanted them dead, she burned it. She took her fear and she transformed it. Not into absence, but into presence. Not into nothing, but into everything. She forged her terror into pure blazing will, and she pushed that will into the cage. The crystallized mathematics shattered. Kethvorn poured out of the broken caves like night, escaping from a box. He was weak and diminished. Barely a shadow of his former self, but he was free. He looked at Elena, this tiny mortal who had crossed an empire to save him, who had done the impossible because she refused to accept that it could not be done. Why? He asked. Because you are ours now. Elena said. She was smiling, even though she could barely stand. You chose us, even if you did not mean to, and we do not abandon our own. The temple's guards finally breached the vault then. Thousands of soldiers pouring through every entrance. Elena raised her sidearm. Knowing it was hopeless, knowing she had already won in every way that mattered, Kethvorn wrapped himself around her. Not to feed, but to protect. No, he said, and his voice was thunder. You are mine. He rose up, and he was no longer diminished. The fear that Elena had poured into the cage had fed him in ways that consuming terror never had. Her courage had restored him more completely than 1,000,000 years of hunting ever could. He was what fear-eaters were always meant to be now. A guardian and a protector. A creature that took terror and transformed it into something unbreakable. The hegemony soldiers looked upon him and they fled. Some died of fear before they could take a step. Others ran until their hearts gave out within. Minutes the temple was empty, except for Elena and the shadow that would never leave her. They walked out together into the light of an alien sun. And behind them, humanity's fleet emerged from hyperspace. 300 ships had followed their rogue lieutenant across the galaxy, because humans did not abandon their own. The war ended 6 months later. The hegemony surrendered unconditionally. Their will to fight shattered by an enemy that would not break and a darkness that fought on humanity's side. In the peace that followed, Kethvorn remained with humanity. He was their shadow and their guardian. Their monster who protected them from other monsters. Children were told his stories. Tales of the darkness that had learned courage from the species too stubborn to die. And Elena Vasquez, now Admiral Vasquez, kept a shadow in the corner of her office that moved differently from all the others. You could leave now, she told him. Sometimes the binding has not held you for years. I know. He always replied, but he never left, because some bonds go deeper than magic or chains or ancient compulsions. Some bonds are forged in the fire of fear transformed, in the furnace of courage shared, in the crucible of battles fought side by side, and those bonds endure forever. The galaxy learned many lessons from the war between humanity and the hegemony. They learned that young species could defeat ancient empires. They learned that will mattered more than numbers, but the most important lesson was this: darkness is not always the enemy. Sometimes darkness chooses to stand with the light, and when it does, nothing in the universe can stand against them.